Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. Did you know that the Campaign for Historic Trades, which is powered by Preservation Maryland, is the sponsor of 3 registered apprenticeship programs? The campaign also hosts workshops across the nation, maybe even one in your backyard. Visit historictrades.org to learn more and find a way to learn a trade. This is Nick Redding. You are once again listening to PreserveCast, and today we have a very special guest. I was telling him before we click record that we review a lot of books on PreserveCast, and this has been absolutely one of my favorites that I've had the chance to read. I told him I couldn't put it down, and that is absolutely true. And I'm hoping everybody who listens will pick up a copy as well and enjoy it. It's a perfect year to do that here in the 250th. Today's guest is New York Times bestselling biographer Brian J. Jones. And Jones is known for covering iconic and creative geniuses who have made really amazing contributions to pop culture, and particularly American pop culture. He's explored people like Jim Henson, George Lucas, Washington Irving, Dr. Seuss. But for our purposes, his most recent book and the focus of today's episode is The Capitol, the surprising biography of an American building, which was published just this past June. And what I think is great, and Brian touched on it before we pressed record, is that this truly is the biography. It's as if the Capitol is a person that he is profiling. So we're going to dive into all that in the process of this and what he uncovered in the process. But before we get there, tell us a little bit about yourself, Brian. Like, where did you grow up, and what put you on the path to being such a great writer?
Sure. Well, I appreciate that. I actually grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And my first job out of college, though, was I went to go work for my U.S. Senator at that time, which was Pete Domenici. And so I was hired just to answer constituent mail. That was my very first job in D.C. Eventually became a policy advisor doing issues like civil rights and welfare and education and the arts and things like that, and did that for about 8 to 10 years. Worked for the Senate. Now that they call it the Help Committee. At my time, it was Education and Labor, I think was what it was called at that time, working for Jim Jeffords of Vermont. And that was actually, as I found out later, being a Hill staffer is really good prep for writing biography, because your job is to compile lots of information and talk to lots of people about policies and, bills and things your senator wants to do, and trying to distill and compress all that information into one place. And if you can, be brief, which is often an issue for me, but send your member in a 1 or 2 pager to advise them on what to do. And that's kind of what biography is, or writing nonfiction is. It's distilling a lot of information and getting a lot of information from different places and using it to tell your story. So at the time, I didn't know that was great prep for what I wanted to do later. But about 7 years after I left the Hill, that was when I published the biography of Washington Irving, which was actually a book that I just wanted to read, which was how I backed into biography. It was almost a happy accident.
Yeah, it's sort of, I've heard that before from different authors or inventors too. Like, it's like the best thing to invent is the thing that you want to use, or the best book to write is the one that you want to read.
Yeah, absolutely.
But a lot of smart people who know a lot about issues aren't always good at distilling them or at starting. Like, the idea of starting a book about an iconic figure in particular, like an unknown person is one thing, but like Washington Irving, there's a lot of people out there, at least specialists, who feel like they know a lot about that. Is that an intimidating thing to start, particularly with biography? Some of these people that you've profiled, like, they truly are iconic, and that's not like hyperbole.
I mean, I've actually, one of my both blessings and curses is that I do very high profile figures. And fortunately, with some, I do some that had never been done before. Jim Henson, for example, had never been the subject of a biography, which I couldn't believe at the time that I started talking about it with the Henson family. And he's a Marylander, in fact.
Another Marylander, absolutely.
Yeah. So, Irving was one of those subjects that hadn't been done in about 80 years, I think, when I got interested in him. And the only book that was around was a 1935 big, fat 2-volume biography of him written by a Yale academic who clearly did not like him very much. And it was one of those things I got done with. And I thought, man, that's a real shame because he seems like a really interesting guy. And I had pitched that book as sort of, I was calling him the Sinatra of the 19th century because he was one of these characters that was just hugely famous. And people wanted him to run for public office and writers wanted him to do what we would now call blurb, wanted him to blurb their books. And just a really fascinating character. And he was just one of those guys that I thought, man, there's so much more there than just this really sort of turgid academic take on him. And so that's what I always try to bring to these figures is look at them, look at the life through the work, but also look at the work through the life, which I think makes it so much more interesting because those things, especially with big creatives, are genuinely intertwined.
So obviously the experience on the Hill had a big impact on the way in which you approach this work and things like that. Is there an academic presence to this too? I think a lot of people think of like biographers, you've got to be this amazing reaser and that sort of thing.
No, I mean, I'm not an academic. I was an English major in college. I ran a comic book store at one point. I worked in movie stores. Like I said, my first real job out of college was answering constituent mail, and so that job was learning how to talk with people. So I think, talking to people sort of the way I always view writing these books. It's, let me sit down and tell you a story and let me tell you what I think is really interesting about these guys. I often run seminars for Biographers International organization where I talk about archival research. And, I always tell researchers, don't be embarrassed to tell people, through your work, hey, when I was researching this really was interesting to me. My back came off the chair when I found this in the archives. This interested me. I think this will interest you. When you're interested as a biographer, I think that's when your readers are interested as well. It's not just a matter of if you're just trying to get things down and say, and then he did this, and then he went there. Nobody wants to read that. But if you say he went there, and you know what, on the way, the windshield of his car blew out because it was so cold when he was driving to New York. Little things like that can make your work so much more interesting, even as you're telling the story you sort of need to tell in a narrative like that.
Right, and it keeps you going. That's at least how I felt in the Capital book. Is that I didn't want to put it down because it was, I kept you would find something funny or there would be something ironic, and you're like, oh, I got to get more of this, or the guy who wanted.
There's so many interesting characters in the book too, and what I love about it is every chapter tends to have two people really kind of going at it. You've usually got an architect and a superintendent who are kind of in each other's way. And the architect, is trying to get his vision to be built, but the superintendent is the one tasked with building it. And many times the superintendents have a bit of an ego and are trying to make their imprint on the building. And so there's some friction in there. And that makes it actually really fun to write when you're sort of watching these two characters just constantly tangling with each other.
Yeah, there's a lot of friction. There's a lot of disagreement. And then there's just weird oddities and stuff. Maybe we can talk about something, the guy who wanted to revive Washington, all that kind of stuff. Great. We can get into a little bit of that. But obviously we kind of buried the lead here. The Capital is the book. It was just released in June of 26. The title is The Capital, The Surprising Biography of an American Building. Let's talk about this book. So why the Capitol? Where did the spark for this idea come from? I mean, obviously, you've told us about your experience on Capitol Hill. It would seem that would be it. Is that right? Where did this all come from?
So this book was written as my sort of somebody called it a love letter to the building, which I think is fair. It was sort of my love letter to the building after January 6th. As a congressional staffer and especially as a Senate staffer, watching people inside the Senate chamber really, really upset me. When I was a Senate staffer, for example, we used to fall over ourselves. The senator's executive assistant some evenings would say around 7:00. Our senator lived on the Hill. He lived 3 blocks away, and she would say, "Senator's over on the floor. He's just going to walk home once he's done. Somebody needs to take him his briefcase and his coat." And we would fall over each other to be the one who got to take him his briefcase and his coat over on the floor, because it meant you got to go over to the Capitol and you got to go in through the cloakroom and you got to walk out onto the floor. And it's a really, really special place. Even as a staffer, it's called floor privileges. It's not floor right. It's your workplace, but it's a place that you don't just have, you're not entitled to it. It's not a right. You have floor privileges. So watching the building be invaded by people who didn't understand or respect the importance of that building, who were treating it like they were storming a Kmart, really, really affected me deeply. And this was my way of sort of responding, trying to give something back to that building. I was, like I said, I was as a Hill staff, my phone was ringing off the hook all day during that. People saying, "Can you believe this? Are you watching this?" So this was sort of written as my response, a way for me to give back to that building where I spent almost 10 years of my life.
Yeah, I mean that's a powerful reason to write a book, and it comes from a powerful place, and it makes sense now within that context of that. What somebody else called it, a love letter. It kind of reads like that, and the building is the central character. So this was, you're a biographer, and generally biography deals with life, right, and the life of a person in normal circumstances. But you've treated the building as the person almost. Tell us about that process. Was that challenging? Did it require a different approach, or was it pretty familiar?
That's a great question, Nicholas. What it required was a little bit of a different mindset, but only at first. So when I first, started discussing this idea with my agent, he said, I love this. This is a great idea. And I said, well, I'm a little nervous about this because, this feels like history, and I'm not a historian per se. I'm a biographer. I write about people. And he said, treat the Capitol as a person. This is a biography. Make the Capitol your main character, and everybody who moves in and out of the lives of the life of that character. Now, it's a character with an exceptionally long life, still alive, but born over 200 years ago. But he said, just treat it that way. And once I got that sort of as my in my head, it really made it a lot of fun then moving forward. So I tried to keep it very Capitol centric. If something happened that didn't happen in the building, I didn't use it, even if it kind of, I talk in the book about a lot of violence inside the building. And there were a lot of really interesting, fun stories about, people sort of going at it, but they would take their fight to, a bar down the street. So it didn't happen in the building. So I wouldn't necessarily cover that. So I tried to keep it very tight and focused on the building, because otherwise it can become sprawling and out of hand in a real hurry if you don't do that.
Yeah, and I think it's, this is obviously a podcast that focuses on preservation. We sort of cater to the preservation community, and we talk about these issues through the lens of preservation. And one of the big pieces of preservation, obviously, is architectural history. And some architectural history, not to besmirch any architectural historians out there, can be kind of dry. And I feel like this is the opposite of that. And in some ways, as preservation thinks about how it appeals to a broader audience and how we get our message out there and talk about why these places matter, I feel like books like this offer us a little bit of a glimpse into that, because they personalize, they kind of make a building, the building is only so important as what happens inside of it and the people with it and how it impacts people. And I feel like that's an interesting aspect of this, and probably why, in addition to just being a good read, preservationists should read something like this, because every building in some way or another could have a story like this. It seems like you could be the building biographer now.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because there's great books on the architecture of the Capitol, for example, and there's great books on the art inside the Capitol. But they're doing something very specific, and I was trying to bring that in along with a lot of other things as well. I mean, I think one of the things, so I had to learn a lot about architecture, and I tried not to overwhelm people with too many architectural terms. I'm actually doing something very gauche and listening to my own audiobook, which I'm never sure if that's considered classless or not. But there's times in there when I'm listening to the reader, and I'm like,
did you read it yourself?
No, I did not. That is a superpower I do not have.
Yeah,
I have an outstanding reader doing it. Thank God.
Yeah,
because
if you read it yourself, that would be really weird. That's when it crosses the line.
Chapter.
Yeah.
But I was even listening to one chapter, and I was like, "Whew, boy, that was a lot of architectural terms I just threw past people." But I was just trying to keep it to terms like column and portico and things like that. Trying to keep sort of a minimal of terms in there. But I wanted people to know some of these terms because they are important. But on the architectural side of the story, what I think is so fascinating is there's a very deliberate attempt, sometimes successful, sometimes not, to ensure that the materials used in the Capitol are symbolic in a way. They didn't want to build it out of brick. They wanted it out of something more majestic. They wanted it to be marble. They wanted it to be built to last. That's us telling our story just in the materials we're choosing. this experiment is built to last. It's something we want to last. The building sitting at the center of this experiment then should be something we build to last. There was a lot of thought put into that, a lot of many steps of the way.
That's and that comes through. I mean, you that's a thread that is evident in the book about this sort of like built to last, and then the struggle with that too, where it's like but we don't really want to pay for built to last, which is also
always running into the money.
Yeah, and I think you kind of call that out at some point. I remember something along the lines of you saying like this is sort of a very American approach, like we want it to be good, we want it to be fast, and we want it to be cheap. And it's like, well, those three things don't always go well.
Right, the checklist. You can have two of these three things on here, but but you've got to, and so that was a constant fight that a lot of the architects were building too. And many times they had issues where they, when Thomas U. Walter designs the dome, for example, he kind of, it's almost an afterthought. He's just drawing it because he kind of thinks it looks cool. And congressmen came by and they said, we would love to have that. How much would it cost? And, there's no deep analysis done on it. The superintendent says it'll take a year and it'll cost you $1 million. Like there's no thought put into it. They're just sort of spitballing it and making it up as they go. And it ends up being much more expensive than the original guesses were.
Yeah. Shocker. The one thing though about this, so that I'm really curious about is the process. So because it is this building with this phenomenal history and there's so much to it and it's such a big story, describe the research required to publish something like this and get those like really precise details right. Like you have something in there about like I thought this was a funny thing, like the Ohio clock, which you sort of like humorously point out is ironically not from Ohio.
Ironically not from Ohio. Yeah, no one's quite sure why it's called that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And you say that in there, but like there's like one version of that. That's what I'm trying to point out to the listeners. Like there's these like micro details that you've got to get right because someone reading it is going to be like, that's not from Ohio. He didn't, like, do you worry about that? Does that
as somebody who's written about Star Wars, hell yes, I worry about that. You have people who know the details and the intricacies of Star Wars, and they're going to be like, actually, that didn't happen on that scene or that day. They didn't film it. People who know the subject as well or better than you do.
Yeah,
I ran into that with Jim Henson. With Jim Henson, and Muppet fans are very lovely about it. But yeah, there's times where like that's actually not what that episode was called. So with something like this, one of the great assets I had was the U.S. Congress from about 1905. They, at one point, when they were looking at doing some improvements and expansions of the building, they asked for this comprehensive history of the building, at least up through that point, that included documentation and correspondence and legislative debates when they were, building the dome and, when Thornton was designing it and what the original ad looked like in the newspapers. Like they had all this information they had sort of assembled in one place. And it's this gigantic, I think, 1,200 page document. Just called, you'll see it cited in the book all the time as documentary history, just this gigantic book that the Congress had asked for at one point. And there's another point where the Congress had asked for a report into the use of enslaved workers at the Capitol, which was very helpful. They actually had, numbers in there, or at least as well as they could find on the public record. So there was a lot of really good information, sort of what I call hidden in plain sight. You had to know sort of where to go to dig for it. And some of these things you could find by reading other books about architecture or art or histories of the Capitol or the era, and just go check the sources at the end. That's one of the things that's why we as nonfiction writers are real sticklers for people citing things, because a lot of times you go back and you look at a citation, you go, oh man, I didn't even know that existed. And you go and try to find that source. It's just digging through, just tons and tons of material. Some of it, is easy to find, some not. There's a fantastic book that just came out a couple of years ago. Maybe you've even covered it, called Potomac Marble, about some of the marble quarries in Maryland and in Loudoun County, written by a guy named, I'm going to butcher his name. I think it's Paul Kleingold, I think is his name. But it was a book that I just sort of like stumbled across. I think it was cited someplace else. So, it's just one of those, read your primary materials or secondary materials, but always look at the citations, look at the sources, find out where people are getting their information. There's a lot of congressional correspondence, and you start looking at that correspondence and finding out who they were writing to and where is that correspondence located now. And sometimes you find out that they were actually writing to somebody else and it's been sourced wrong, and you go back and find the original letter. But it's just a matter of, just picking through the pieces and trying to like pull the story out of just this dense tranche of documents.
And how much of that has to be done in person? Is that, and nowadays, like, were you traveling quite a bit to do that? I mean, it seems like a lot of that story is probably in DC, at least in the archives in DC.
So much of this stuff now is actually digitized. Library of Congress, almost all of their photos now are digital, and you can get almost all of them that way. The documentary history I found, I think I found on the Internet Archive, all, the entire document. So most of it you can actually find. And, I spend an awful lot of time ordering books to read and things like that. One of the advantages I did have is just having lived and worked in DC and in the Capitol. I knew the building and the area well enough where it wasn't one of those things where I would read something and think, oh God, I wonder where that is, or I wonder what that looks like. I kind of knew all that. There were times when I had to sort of trust but verify. There were pieces of it where I'd read about something and think, okay, is that still there? It was there when I lived there or when I was working on the Hill in 1998, but is it actually still there? And so I would go and I would look for pictures that were recent in the newspaper, for example, like trying to make sure the Ohio clock was still sitting where I said it was, and it is. So because you can see press conferences in front of it. So it was just a matter of sort of just doing, they call those on the couch biographies because you don't have to leave the house. But in my case, so much of that information, because so much of it took place so long ago, there's nobody you need to go interview and nobody, nothing you really need to go, get. As long as you can just keep getting those resources and get those archival resources. And in the case of this particular project, so many of those archival resources are publicly held, which means you can just go get them online.
And so did you end up ground truthing anything? Did you go back at any point during the process just to kind of like check a few things out?
I went back twice. Unfortunately, one time when I went, it was closed, so I didn't get to go. I didn't get to go back there. It was I'd gone back actually once.
Sign
I was
out
done
front
writing
should have
it.
told you.
Yeah, it was one of those. I went back after I was done writing, and I just wanted to do a little bit of spot checking. And I got up there, and I walked to the visitor center, and they were like, "Oh, it was like vacation. Sorry, folks, park's closed. We was up front. Should have told you." And the park was closed. I couldn't get in. So I did go once just to sort of stroll through it. But when I was a Hill staffer, and this was also pre-September 11th, man, your congressional ID could get you anywhere. I would walk into that building on the weekends and just kind of stroll through it, and you can duck under chains as long as you've got your badge around your neck. And just walk hallways that the public never sees and that are, members only. Now, you can't get on the floor or anything like that, but you can get up in the galleries and kind of just walk the building. So I spend a lot of weekends just sort of walking that building in the days when you could still do that. Even as staffers, I think they've limited even how much access you can have.
Yeah, and you've documented a lot of those changes in there. A lot probably had to fall to the editing floor. You kind of mentioned in the acknowledgments, I think, or at some point you talk about your editors and anything that was just odd or strange that you wish had made it, but frankly was just too obscure. It was just too far afield, or like, but you were like, I really wish we could have this in here.
Oddly, no. And in fact, there were some places where my editor, cut some things out, but I never went, oh, I wish I could get that back. Because, for example, there were, one of the really sort of funny and entertaining relationships in there is during building up to the Civil War and working on the dome, which is the architect Thomas Walter and his superintendent Montgomery C. Meggs. And these two are going at it constantly. And I had even more in that chapter about the two of them going at it. And my editor eventually said, we've got it. Like it's getting to be a bit much. So some of that got knocked out. And when I read back through there, I was like, no, she's right. That's a bit much. So no, I mean, pretty much everything that I wanted in there stayed in there. And that's, this is, I think, my shortest book ever, which for me is I guess not saying something, because most of my books are like 603 pages and 587. And this one's like 400 something, one of my shorter books. But yet everything's in it kind of that I wanted to say. And one of the great things about my editors, and this is editors I've worked with for my last 3 books, is, my editor always tells me it takes what it takes. And so, they don't want me writing a 900-page book, but they're always kind of willing to let me go down, side streets and alleys and things like that, as long as I can come back and, try to bring it home at the end. So no, I'm very fortunate in that. And there's really nothing on the cutting room floor that I'm going, God, I wish I could get that back.
I'm curious about the process of writing a biography in this way, in that, is it just that you take this person's life and you tell their story? Do you have an angle on it? Are you trying to sort of make a through line? Like you've talked about a couple through lines, like, with this building as the focus, building it to last, but then also all of these disagreements and arguments. Is it that you were trying to kind of tell a story through argument, are there through lines? Was there, not to be like, oh, did you have an angle on this thing or did you have a bias? But like, what was the story you were trying to convey beyond it just that this is a building that can have a story told like a human?
Yeah.
What's the way that what are you trying to convey here?
I think, again, it came out of sort of my post January 6th response to this. And it was interesting. I actually see a therapist. And at one point while I was writing this, and I was really, really blocked on it at one point, I was having a hard time starting it. I was, in biography and nonfiction, the research is the fun part. We can always research, and you have to start. They always say that, the research is never completed. It's just abandoned because you're always at the point where you're like, I got to start this. And, and so I was having a heck of a time starting it, and I finally started it. But my therapist at one point, she said, fall in love with your book again. She's like, you took this on because you were angry about something, but, fall in love with this, which really helped my mindset on that. But, what I really was hoping would happen was, again, my response to January 6th was, this building's really special. This really stands for something. It stands for something important that I don't think people appreciated again when they were just inside that building and breaking windows and, tear gassing cops. This stands for something really, really big. And I wanted to convey that. But the more I got into it, the more interested I even got in just understanding how much this really does reflect the American character, and that there was so much ad-libbing going on. There's so much imagination going on. There's so much serendipity. There's so much good luck. There's so much having the right people in the right places at the right time going on. It's very much reflective of the American character. It relies on the work and skill of enslaved people. It really reflects who we are, where we've been, where we currently stand, and who we aspire to be. And, that was a bigger bite than I thought was going to happen when I took the project on. I really just wanted people to understand, hey, this is a really cool and really important building. But it turned into something much more symbolic, even as I was going along, that really kind of moved me, in fact. Like I said, I was not aware that there was so much care given to materials and so much care given to the art and things like that. So there, it really does reflect the American character, sometimes deliberately, sometimes serendipitously.
Yeah, the reflection is there. That where the reflection comes across, because you're talking about different sort of trends and through lines in American history as well. In addition to sort of the cheap, fast, and good, there's also the the sectional differences that comes out very early on, and sort of this compromise approach as to where the capital itself will eventually land. That's a
there's compromise baked into the building, even when it's still just lines on a map. Where are we going to put this? Which state's going to get it? Is it going to be in the north? Is it going to be in the south? And then once they find the location, where in the federal city is it going to go? And once they figure that out, what's it going to look like? And they hold a national contest for designs for the building, which is really charming. It's something that they've done throughout history. In ancient Athens, they were holding contests to design public buildings. But, there's something really charming and very American in saying, hey, Americans should have a say in their own iconography. This is your building. You get to have a say in designing it. There's something reassuring and charming and kind of naive in that as well, especially in a time when you don't really have any professional architects, and you've got drawings coming in where there's one where one of the drawings has it's a building with a gigantic weather vane maybe, or it's a statue, but it's almost as big as the building itself. You have people that can't draw just sending in these really charming drawings of what they think a cool Capitol building should look like. It's really inspiring actually to see like Americans are invested in their own experiment in 1792.
Yeah, that part is inspiring, and it's also sort of reaffirming to also see all the squabbles and arguments, because those have always been there. You have a part in there.
Absolutely. And you do have the regional debates in there, and you have a lot of politics, and it's so interesting to me that George Washington, the brilliant tactician, the brilliant politician, he's the one who, after they have the contest for the design of the Capitol, a guy named William Thornton, he's a doctor and an amateur architect, has the winning design. And in second place is actually a professional architect who they say, well, we're going to, we liked your design, but, you came in second, but we think you're a great architect. So what Washington says is, Thornton has the winning design, but you, who came in second, you're the architect that gets to build it. I mean, what a horribly bad idea that is to have the loser construct the winner's project. And this is something Washington does, thinking this is going to this will settle the mood and take the temperature down in this. And it's just, it's friction from moment one.
Yeah, it's one of the worst decisions sort of throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a terrible decision.
It's sort of incredible that it actually ends up being constructed, given the squabbles that start from the beginning. And it's also interesting, speaking of Washington, and I had not seen these quotes before, but I was not surprised by them, that there were people even at the time being like, of course Washington wants it to be where it is in Maryland. It's only a few miles from Mount Vernon. Like this is sort of a giveaway to Washington. Like he's using all of this to benefit himself, right. Which is interesting, kind of seeing that, early on
for him. It's a good commute for him. It's a good commute for Jefferson. Much easier that way.
And it also maybe benefits him commercially, right? Like having a giant capital just a few miles from your plantation.
Well, yeah, and at one point he works with one of the architects to build some boarding houses right near the Capitol where congressmen can stay, when they're in D.C. I mean, he's working the angles a little bit there. And I just, but I love that he fell in love with the idea of a dome. And once people knew Washington wanted that dome, everybody's trying to submit drawings that have domes in it. And Thornton, who wins the national contest, anytime people keep messing with his layout, he just keeps reminding them, Washington signed off on my drawing. He keeps sort of throwing Washington's name around, sometimes when it didn't do him any good. But, it was really, Washington's imprimatur on that really, really made that project happen.
Yeah. And you also bring a lot of life. I mean, I feel like a future subject could be Latrobe.
Latrobe's a fascinating guy. Yeah, a really fascinating guy.
I was going to say a future subject architect for you for a biography could be Latrobe, because he touches in so many different places. He just keeps popping up through early American history. And I didn't realize.
And you find out how many architects he trained as well, too. Yeah.
Yeah, who he trained. And I mean, obviously his legacy here in Maryland and in the Basilica in Baltimore, which still stands and is iconic. But I also didn't really get a sense. I had never really dug that much into him as a person. And, he's in a business sense, he doesn't do very well. He's going bankrupt, and he's sort of, I don't want to besmirch him and say he's a jerk, but he kind of gets himself into a lot of trouble with his mouth.
He has a meltdown in front of the president of the United States.
Yeah, that was wild. And do you want to describe that for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the ways building, projects happen is you have to have people, whether you like it or not, you do have to have people that have ego involved in projects like this. It's the way things get done. It's the way they try to make their mark. But Latrobe was another one of those guys that was just constantly sort of bickering with his bosses. And he gets hauled down to the White House. I think it's in front of James Monroe. I can't remember now. And he starts fighting with his direct report right in front of the president, and essentially just assaults him. And, the guy's a veteran of the War of 1812. He can only use one arm, and Latrobe just sort of puts his hands on him and shakes him. And the president looks at him very coldly and says, do you know who I am? Do you know what you just did? And Latrobe says, yes, I beg your pardon, and submits his resignation the next day. But it was one of those. Another one of those stories in that book where you've just constantly got two people who do not get along, and conflict is almost always inevitable when that happens.
Yeah. And before we kind of move here from this part of it, but I brought it up in the beginning, and I don't want to betray the listener here. There's one person who wants to revive Washington. I was trying to explain this to my family, like over dinner, and they were just like mouths agape. Like they were like,
it's crazy.
Really?
So William Thornton is his first job is he's a physician, and he's sort of classically trained. He was trained in Europe, and even as an American, when he comes out of Tortola, and has a big plantation down there, and he's sort of a dilettante. He does it all, and he keeps his medical practice going, but he's doing a little bit of everything. And once he's become sort of the first, he's actually considered the first architect of the Capitol. But he's still a physician, and he's actually studied tracheotomies. And so when Washington is dying and on his deathbed, they actually call Thornton, who considered himself one of Washington's best friends. I'm not sure that ran the other way, but Thornton really thought he was very, very close to Washington. And so Thornton goes speeding down to Mount Vernon to perform a tracheotomy on Washington, who was gasping for breath. And by the time he gets there, Washington's died. So he never gets to see Washington alive. But he has this crackpot idea where it's sort of like the Reanimator, where he's like, if we warm his body up and pump him full of sheep's blood, we can revive him and bring him back to life. It is insane. And he's very disappointed that they sort of like dismissed that suggestion immediately. Like, he's convinced that this was going to work.
And do you know scientifically that it's insane, Brian? Have you tried it just to kind of ground truth it?
I have not tried it, but I can probably tell you it is scientifically insane.
Okay, all right, good to know.
I should disclaim that I am not a physician, so
you're not a physician. So
somebody smarter than me will actually know whether that works or not.
Yeah. And I mean, Washington, once his body is cold and he's passed away, I mean, there's all these different theories and plans on how he can be honored with the Capitol itself and maybe be buried under it. And you kind of go into that whole story as well.
Yeah, that's why there's still a chamber in the very bottom of the Capitol that was intended to have his sarcophagus in it. And there were a lot of different ideas on what that would look like. They were talking about cutting holes in the floor of the rotunda so you could look down at a statue that would be above where Washington's sarcophagus was. Another person suggested making an opening all the way down so you could peer down and see the sarcophagus, not really have a statue. And they spent an awful lot of time. They realized that, they were approaching his 100th anniversary and realized they'd never done anything. Martha Washington had agreed at one point to let his body be moved there. Broke her heart. She writes a heartbreaking letter to them and basically says, I'm doing this for the good of the public. But by the time the Congress gets around to sort of formally and officially asking for his body to be conveyed, his grandnephew, I think, down at Mount Vernon says, absolutely not. Washington made it explicitly clear he was to be buried at his beloved Mount Vernon. We ain't moving him. And that sort of just solves the matter right there. They never addressed the issue again.
Yeah, I bring it up in the context of any other sort of missteps in like things that they proposed that just never ended up happening that maybe were for the best in the end.
There's one really crazy idea where at one point somehow early on one of the architects, it might even have been Latrobe, said that there were supposed to be, or maybe it was Thornton, said there were supposed to be actually 2 domes on it and not just one. And so they had sort of this low dome at the front and then this raised dome at the rear that would have been over a conference room. It's just a terrible, terrible idea. At one point in the basement of the Capitol in modern times, you could see sort of mock-ups of what a lot of these drawings would look like. And there was one of that proposal. And it's crazy. It's ugly. It was a terrible idea. Thank God it never got any further than just some drawings for it. So that was one really ill-advised idea for it. One of the other things they wanted to do when they were considering expanding it was rather than building wings on the end, they wanted to push the east front way out and sort of build another extension going that way and doing it there. Probably not a great idea. It would have made the building look very weird. But, it was a very seriously considered to sort of, carry that east front forward, 100 yards or something and build the extension there. So there's always been a lot of sort of improvising in that building as they were considering extensions and some good ideas and some really bad ideas. One of the issues that they had as they were working on the extensions was you do have it built on a hill. It's literally on Capitol Hill and the hill falls away behind it. So it limited the way you could move that building toward the west. And you had to really dig down deep if you're going to find foundational stone beneath it. So, even just the fact of where it was located meant sometimes they couldn't do things that they might have wanted to do because it was going to be hard or very expensive to be able to deal with that hill.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, too, that as most people know, our Congress is sort of artificially capped at a certain size. It doesn't expand as the population gets bigger because I think in the early 20th century they capped it.
Yes.
It's interesting because if it had continued to grow proportionate to the way it grew in the early republic, the building as it currently stands wouldn't be able to hold those people. And so it makes me wonder what would happen if we were to ever change that. I was sort of thinking
if we either acquired a lot of states or actually did, a proportional representation.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking more the House, the proportional representation. Yeah, because
Yeah,
it would be
the
like
house would be
thousands.
insane. I don't know where they would have to figure something out for that, because there is not enough room in that House chamber. It's already pretty tight over there as it is. The Senate, they've probably got a little more room, if but since you only have to add 2 people per state, regardless of size.
Yeah.
They've probably got enough room that they could go, I don't know, 10 more states, even if that ever happened. But the House, even now, if you actually did the math on it with the current 50 state setup, it would be gigantic.
Yeah, so it's interesting sort of challenges, and I mean that's kind of what I wanted to get to here is that, like this is a story of like revolution, truly from the revolution, and then all of these revolutions and evolutions, and you cover how the building has changed dramatically. I mean that it was burned out and parts of it had to be rehabbed, and I sort of look at that as as an aside, sort of this like charming battle over demolition or preservation, and they end up saving some of the walls and sort of using it there, saying hey it's cheaper to use what's here. So it's an early preservation story in some ways. Did your research sort of change your opinion on how buildings like this should be restored or preserved moving forward? How did you kind of come into this from that preservation angle, and how did you leave it?
I mean, I've always been a stickler for trying to preserve the character of old buildings as much as possible, whether they're buildings that are 200 years old or 1,500 years old. There's something I think important about preserving that and remembering that. And I always think it's a shame when you see these photographs of just beautiful old buildings from even around, turn of the century, 20th century now, turn of the 20th century, that are no longer there. Beautiful old hotels and things. And I understand that, progress and things like that moves on, but it's just a shame to lose some of these really beautifully designed buildings. So I didn't really change in that regard. I've always thought that that's very important. What was so interesting was to find out how important it was to people early on. And when they were working on extending the West Front, once the Western Front was starting to sort of fall apart in the 1970s, there was, some really hard discussions about preservation versus restoration versus tearing it down and starting over again. Not the whole building, but the West Front. And eventually sort of the preservation prevailed. And rather than build out, they kind of went down and covered up they needed some more space, and they covered up the promenade out on the west side and converted that into office spaces out there. So no, it didn't change my personal point of view going through that. But I'm hoping people who might be curious about it or skeptical can come away understanding why these things are important. And, partly it was back in the 1800s, it was political. They were, after the building was burned, there was a real concern that the Congress was going to look at this burnt out Capitol and say, well, there you go. They burned the building down. Let's just move the Capitol someplace else. And
right, you talk about that.
Did not want that to happen. They did not want that debate. They wanted to shut that debate down immediately and not start that up again. So that's when they went back and appraised the building, and they did come back and say, no. The exterior walls are still in pretty good shape here. And, and there were places where, Latrobe had been determined to build, concrete footage, and those were holding. So, that actually gave them a hint on how to do this moving forward. They knew what had worked and what hadn't. They knew building with wood was a really bad idea. But there was partly a political decision in there. They did not want people to just throw up their hands and say, let's move it back to Philadelphia, or let's take it down to South Carolina, or let's move it west because the nation's going to grow west. Let's move it to, Kentucky, or let's move it out to Illinois or something.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think sometimes we miss those things. We sort of see a building and where it's always been, and we think that was always certain. But in the context of those decisions being made at the time, that it was anything but certain. Yeah, no, that's a precarious moment, in the life of the Capitol, because they could have, just bothered to not even rebuild that building at that point. It was mostly sort of a smoking husk, and they could have opted to not do anything and move the entire including the capital of the nation, even someplace else. They were starting to, debate that again. And again, Madison's the one that sort of shut that down, because he was the one that had to cut the deal in the first place to get it located on the shores of the Potomac. So I think he was really trying to get that one put to bed very, very quickly. Yeah, and it also benefits him too because it's closer to home. So there's a little bit. There's a little bit of that there. Virginia delegates, to get. Yeah. There. So obviously, there's still you talk about it in the sort of as you come to close the book. There's still debates and fights over how we're going to manage this place. The architect of the Capitol, it's kind of flipped round and round about how it gets appointed, how long it's there. how long that person can serve, how they can be fired, whether or not they can be fired. So there's a lot that's still, being written about this building in that context, and in the context of what caused you to write it, and just the, all of the current machinations over buildings and history. Do you remain optimistic about the future of the Capitol, having written this?
Yeah, I mean, that difficulty with the architect of the Capitol, the Congress only just sort of recently put it entirely under their own management. It used to be that the architect could be appointed by the president and confirm, sort of like you do with like a cabinet member. And I think the Congress finally realized, this is our building, our house, our rules. This is our building, and we're going to be the ones that determine who the architect is. And so there's a very nonpartisan or bipartisan, I guess, commission that does all this now. So they've essentially kicked the executive branch out of it, which has always been sort of a long going debate in the building anyway. I mean, you look back at one point, it was, the executive branch has sort of been in control of it, and it was in the Department of War at one point, and there were fights on the floor saying, why are you putting a civil building underneath the Department of War? What do military engineers know that civilian engineers don't? There's always been contention about who's got official oversight authority of that building. And even once, it's in the executive branch, which branch which department in the executive branch should have that authority? What's fitting? Should it be interior? Should it be war? Should it be its own thing? So, that fight sort of boomeranged on up through the next 150 years, and they've sort of resolved it now by determining how the architect gets appointed, what the term is. But it like I said, our house, our rules. It belongs to the Congress now entirely, which is probably a good thing. And there's a commitment to take care of the building now. I mean, the visitor center was big when that thing finally opened. There was a lot of practicality behind it, and especially that had been on the books for quite a while, a visitor center. But it was September 11th that finally goosed them into some definitive action on that. Meaning, we better figure out a way to really secure this building and figure out a way to keep the public in the building, moving into the building, but in a much more controlled way, so we know the entrance everyone's coming in through. So very well thought out, and a big, expensive but beautiful project, and doesn't really impede the front of the Capitol. It's a sunken entrance into the visitor center. It's not a building sitting out there on the lawn, which was very smart as well. So some real thought put into that, respecting Olmsted's landscaping and layout when they were building that. So I think that there's still some deliberation and some care put into that building. I think members understand the importance of that building, even as times it seems that they don't. So maybe I'm naive. I try to remain hopeful on it, having worked in that building and lived almost literally within the shadow of it. I lived for years, 4th and Constitution at one point, and 6th and C and Northeast at one point. I had no car. I walked to work every day. I walked down the street toward the Capitol every single day. I'm still inspired by that building. I'm still inspired by what that building stands for. And I really hope that people reading this book will come away with a similar understanding, respect, and kind of awe for the building itself, if not for the American experiment. I'm still hopeful that we're there somewhere.
So, what's next for you? What's on the docket? Are you going to do the White House?
I'm going to do the White House. I'm going to do the Supreme Court. Then I'm going to do the Library of Congress. I'm just kidding. I don't know what's up next. I haven't had that conversation yet. It's funny. Having done Jim Henson and George Lucas, for example, everybody tells me I need the Labyrinth trifecta and I should do David Bowie next. But Bowie's been done so very recently. So there's that. I don't think I can add anything there. I'm a huge Beatles fan. I made a real serious run at Ringo Starr, who's never really been the subject of a very deep and intensive bio. But he said, nobody cares about anything but those 8 years. No, with peace and love. So he told me no. I have not done a musician yet. I have not done a comedian. So I have not done a woman. So there's plenty of ground out there for me to look for sources, but I haven't come up with one yet.
And it unlikely to be architecture or potentially architecture?
Say it again.
Unlikely to be architecture, or is it
I read an architecture book.
Yeah.
If I feel like there's something I can bring to it, that's the main thing. It's for example, there've been several books written on George Lucas, not for a while, but I really felt that I could bring something to that story that hadn't been done before, because I was going to try to put my arms around everything that had been written on him and talked about with him, and find a through line in his story, which is essentially about control. I felt I could bring something new to that story for him. If I can write an architectural book that there's something I feel I can bring to it that a lot of other really smart people haven't, then I would do that.
Well, you've done something very smart with this book, and we appreciate you joining us today. Our guest, of course, has been Brian J. Jones, and we've been talking all about his new book, The Capitol, The Surprising Biography of an American Building, which was published just this past June in 2026. We'll be putting a link in the show notes so that you can pick up a copy for yourself and read this fascinating history here in this 250th anniversary. Brian, it's been a pleasure to have you on, and looking forward to maybe bringing you back again in the future to talk about whatever it is you cover next.
Well, that would be great. This has been a blast. I really appreciate it, Nicholas. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to preservecast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.